everybody out with us this morning, especially those who are visiting with us. Um, we appreciate your presence, and hopefully that things will go well with all of us. Those that are away traveling, we hope that they have safe travels and are able to come back to us. Today we're going to start looking at the parables of Jesus. And this is going to take us over the next few Sundays as we look into them. Our lesson text is in Matthew chapter 13 and verses 1 through 3. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood on the beach, and he told them many things in parables, saying, a sower went out to sow. In verses 10 through 17, it says, Then the disciples came and said to him, Why do you speak to them in parables? And he answered them, To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, that says, You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. During his earthly ministry, as Jesus went about preaching and teaching, he frequently used parables. In verses 34 and 35 of Matthew 13, it says, All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables indeed. He said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world. It has been estimated that at least 1/3 of Jesus' recorded teaching is found in the parables. Certainly, most of often remembered sayings of Jesus are the parables. It is therefore proper for disciples today to ask such questions as, what is a parable? Why did Jesus teach in parables? What are they about? And how should we interpret them? With this lesson, we begin a study on the parables of Jesus. And this first lesson will serve as an introduction to the parables in general. Succeeding lessons will examine the parables in particular. So let's begin with the introduction to the parables by noticing the definition of parable. It is a transliteration of the Greek parabole, means to place beside or to cast alongside. As defined in Vine's expository dictionary of New Testament words, it signifies a placing of one thing beside another with a view to comparison. Warren Wiersbe's description of a parable says, as a story that places one thing beside another for the purpose of teaching. It puts the known next to the unknown so that we may learn. A parable can usually be identified by the use of the word like. We look in verse 31 of chapter 13 of Matthew, and he says, he put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like. And then in verse 33, he told them another parable, the kingdom of heaven is like. And so the use of the word like helps define the parable. As used in the New Testament, a parable is usually a story or a narrative drawn from nature or human circumstances, from which spiritual lessons can be made by comparison. A common definition of a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. The next question often raised is, why did Jesus teach in parables? In other words, why did he not simply speak straightforward when he was teaching? To understand why, consider the purpose of the parables of Jesus. The primary purpose was to conceal. Jesus began speaking in parables because the hardness of many people's hearts, Matthew 13, verses 10 through 17. The disciples' attitude was such that they were blessed to learn the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Because of the hard hearts of many in the multitude, Jesus began speaking to them in parables. In verses 13 through 15 of Matthew 13, he says, this is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled. And he begins and he says the prophecy from Isaiah. Over in Mark chapter 4 and verses 10 through 12, we see that it says, and when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. And he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see, but not perceive, and may indeed hear, but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. He would then explain the parables in private to his disciples. Down in verses 33 and 34, we find that it says, with many such parables he spoke the word to them, as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples he explained everything. By resorting to parables, Jesus effectively separated the truth seekers from the curiosity seekers. Those seeking the truth would say, explain to us the parable, Matthew 13, verse 36. Whereas the simply curious could easily be sent away. Indeed, Jesus used parables to carry out divine judgment, Matthew 13 and verse 12. He says, for whoever has a good heart, listening ears, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance by virtue of the parable being explained. But whoever does not have a good heart or listening ears, even what he has will be taken away from him, by virtue of being sent away with the Even though the primary purpose in telling parables was to conceal the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven from the multitude, for once the disciples understood the basic meaning of the parables, the comparison of the known, or the earthly truths, with the unknown, or the heavenly truths, would shed further light on the unknown. Therefore, with the help of the Lord's explanation of his parables, we can learn more about the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. This leads us to the next question. What are parables about? Matthew 13 and verse 11 certainly gives us a clue. It says, "And he answered them, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." The general theme is the kingdom of heaven, as suggested in this verse, as illustrated with several parables, which all start with, "The kingdom of heaven is like." Indeed, the kingdom of heaven was the theme of Jesus' itinerary ministry. It is also in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. There are three sub-themes that are stressed in the parables. The character of the kingdom, for example, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the leaven, the parable of the hidden treasure, the parable of pearl of great price. The character of the king, for example, the parable of the workers in the vineyard, and the parable of the lost son. The character of the king's subjects, for example, the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the persistent widow. Of course, the sub-themes often overlap in some parables, but they clearly demonstrate that the overall theme of the parables was the kingdom of heaven. Finally, a few thoughts in answer to the question, how do we interpret the parables? There are two extremes to avoid. One is seeking to find some spiritual truth in every little detail. Secondly, saying that there is only one spiritual truth in each parable. Some guidelines for proper interpretation are: learn from the explanations Jesus gave in those parables he explained, and understanding the parable of the sower helps us to understand other parables. In Mark chapter 4 and in verse 13, he says, "And he said to them, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables?" Jesus therefore went on to explain that parable. Look for the central truth of the parable, making sure that any other truths gleaned from the parable are in harmony with it. Consider carefully the context of Jesus' words, looking for an introduction or an application which may give insight as supplied by either the Lord himself or his inspired writers. Don't use the parables to formulate new doctrine. Remember, parables were originally told to conceal, so they are not always that clear in their meaning. Therefore, don't try to build a case for a doctrine based solely on a parable. Following these sensible guidelines to interpreting the parables of Jesus, we can look forward to the joy of understanding more fully the mysteries or revealed truths of the kingdom of heaven. As we get into the parables themselves, I hope that we will appreciate how blessed we are to live in an age when people who have a desire to learn about the kingdom can do so. In verses 16 and 17 of Matthew chapter 13, it says, "But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you that many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it." What we are about to study in these parables concern things which Abraham, Moses, David, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and many others looked forward to, but did not fully understand in their lifetime. Yet these mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, containing things kept secret from the foundation of the world, are now being made known through the preaching of the gospel of Christ. Now to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery, kept secret since the world began, but now has been made manifest by the prophetic scriptures, has been made known to all nations, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, for obedience to the faith. Romans chapter 16, verses 25 and 26. Have you yet rendered obedience to the faith by responding to the call of the gospel of Christ? Hopefully, by looking at these parables, you will be able to look at them and change your heart if it's not in the right place. If you're here this morning and you have obeyed the gospel of Christ, but you have fallen away, or you've done things that are contrary to his will, and you need to repent of those things, we stand ready to help with you if you want to pray about it and ask for forgiveness. We'll do all that we can to help you be restored back into the kingdom. The choice is yours if you will let it be known as together we sing the invitation song.